everyone. Welcome to today's online summit, What's Ahead for Your Remote Workforce in 2022. This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine and Virtualization Cloud Review, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topics. Many thanks to our generous sponsors, Martello, Splashtop, Okta, RingCentral, and Smarsh, without whom this event would not be possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of Application Development Trends, and I'll be your moderator for the first of 3 information-packed sessions. But before we get underway here, I need to go over just a few housekeeping details. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll do our very best to get to all of them. Our sponsors have provided some resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Be sure to take a moment to check those out. And last but not least, at the end of the 3rd session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a pair of Apple's AirPods Max wireless over-ear headphones with active noise cancellation, spatial audio, and adaptive EQ. But you must be present to win, so stick with us. And now let's get to our first session, the Remote Workforce for Enterprises in 2022, a look ahead. For this session, we called on technologist, content creator, and senior resultant, Howard M. Cohen. In his 35-plus years in the IT industry, Mr. Cohen has held senior executive positions in many of the top channel partner organizations, and he currently writes for and about the IP channel. He is a sought-after speaker, an insightful observer of the technology landscape, and one of my favorite presenters. You are in for a great one. Take it away, Howard.
Thank you so much, John. I just have to keep reminding you, Mr. Cohen was my dad. Anyway, hello, everybody. Welcome to today's session. Those of you who have attended any of my sessions in the past know that I always like to start off by focusing in on a particular word. And today being no different, today's word is anachronism. Now, there are those who've suggested that I am an anachronism, but that's why I call myself a senior resultant. I'll give you a couple of examples of an anachronism. Here's one. There actually may be some of you on this session today that don't know what that is, but that is actually a telephone, a rotary dial telephone. Somebody at some point in time thought that was a good way to indicate the numbers that you were dialing. I can't really imagine how they came up with that, but that was a dial telephone. Another one is the whole concept of counterclockwise, or as they say across the pond, anti-clockwise. Most kids today don't know what a clockwise is because they're used to digital clocks. So we have a lot of anachronisms all around us. What's old stays old, and what's new is new. No other way than that. So I have an anachronism that I guess it's an anachronism of the future. Soon, we will find that the phrase going to work is an anachronism. Nobody will know what you're talking about. What do you mean you're going to work? You get to work. Get to work. Okay. Let's go back in time just a little bit to understand the derivation of this. This gentleman is famous for saying that work has become an activity, not a place, not a destination, just something to do. And this gentleman's name is Robert Frankenberg. At the time that he said it, he was the chairman of the Novell Corporation, Novell at that time being the premier network operating system in the world. And that time was 1994, 28 years ago, at the Massachusetts Software Council meeting, 1994. And he was saying it's become an activity, not a place. And some of you who are as old as I am may remember telecommuting. We were all telecommuting during bad storms or during national conferences in big cities. When there was no way to get through the traffic, we would telecommute. And it didn't really stick. I mean, it happened sometimes. And some people actually did it, but it wasn't a popular thing to do. It wasn't popular. Well, the question that gets raised is, what took so long? Why did it take 28 years for us to get to finally work from home is like almost normal? And the answer is the farmer's shadow. There's an old saying that says that the farmer's shadow is the best fertilizer, meaning that if the farmer's casting a shadow over the crops, those crops will grow. The farmer has to be there, physically be there with the crops. And I say hogwash, nonsense. The farmer does not have to be there, especially with today's agricultural sciences. You can grow wonderful crops, and the farmer can be in some high-rise tower in some city nearby or far away. What has occasioned the change, what has finally brought us to the time where we got used to the idea of working from home, we got kind of liking the idea of working from home, was this: a global pandemic. Yay! Okay. All kidding aside, the global pandemic motivated everybody to send people home to work. And in doing so, it created a global digital transformation. The way in which we use technology changed. And it did so instantly. Literally in a day, we sent everybody home and had them working from home. If you told me you were going to do that, I would laugh at you, right? You would laugh if somebody told you that they were going to just send millions of people home tomorrow and let them all work from home. It's physically impossible, but we did it. We did it because basically we were prepared. We knew that, Frankenberg told us it's an activity, not a place. It became an activity. Instead of going to work, we started getting to work. And then we started to realize we liked it. But, of course, it raised some questions. For example, we have a data center, and nobody's allowed to go to the building. You may remember at the beginning of the pandemic, we were all sheltering in place. Nobody could go out. And so the data center was basically deserted. There's nobody there to run it. We needed a better strategy. And, of course, those people who had already migrated to cloud had a better strategy. And today they report how easy it was to get everybody working from home. Another thing that changed was the whole concept of our threat surface. You're looking at two office buildings. Each of these, and the two taken together, can be considered a threat surface. Basically all of our people are there. They're all connected to the network, and the area around where we're all connected is our fundamental threat surface. If I can protect that, if I can scan that, if I can go hunting for people creating anomalies in that space, I can prevent bad things from happening on my network. That was great. Of course, COVID redefined the threat surface, and now it was massive. People's homes all over the place. Lots of them. So what we're looking at are people's homes in, that's Brooklyn, Manhattan, and New Jersey. You don't even know where those homes may be, but you got to protect them. Part of your threat surface. And by the way, for those of you who think this is some kind of network map, it kind of is. This is a New York City subway map, the best one with this kind of view. So now you have this expanded threat surface, and you have to worry about it. And everybody's office kind of looked like this. And we have no idea then or even now for how long we're going to remain this way. And how long are we going to be continuing to work from home? And it's become a better question because it's not only how long, it's if. Let me explain what I mean. FlexJobs did a survey of employees and their employers to gauge how they felt about the idea of working from home. And from the employees, they found some very interesting stuff. The first thing that employees told them was that remote work leads to better mental health. I don't get as crazy at home. Now, there are some of you who say, are they kidding you? You know, home is nuts. There are others who are saying, yeah, there's a lot less to drive me crazy at home. I think it's different strokes for different folks there, but most employees said that remote work led to a feeling of better mental health. It also was an environment in which they could save some money. They didn't have to go out and buy lunch as much. They didn't have to go out to lunch as much. They didn't have to dry clean their work clothes. Business up top, casual at the bottom. Great, terrific. And they loved that. On average, they save $4,000 a year. The top benefits in the survey, number one, was not having a commute. I don't think that comes as a surprise to anybody. Nobody wanted to get on a train or a bus. They were really happy to just start working. And then the next after that was the cost savings. Some claimed that they saved as much as $5,000 a year. Some said that their savings exceeded $10,000 a year. An amazing amount of money. And this will figure into some of the things we review next. What else did we find out? These employees reported feeling that they were far more productive at home than they were in the office. Why? And the top reasons, there were fewer interruptions at home. Now, I'm sure plenty of you are thinking, you kidding? The kids, my dog, the mail delivery, UPS shows up. I mean, there's all kinds of interruptions. Neighbors stopping by. Home is much more, Well, 68, 2/3 of the people surveyed said there are fewer interruptions at home than at work. There's more focused time where I can sit and think and do my job. It's a quieter work environment at home. Clearly, a lot of the people they surveyed had no children. It's a more comfortable workplace. Not for nothing, but yeah, I've always had a much more comfortable office at home than I did because I would spend more on the furniture. It's a more comfortable workplace. The interesting one for me was avoiding office politics. More than half were looking to avoid office politics. And boy, I don't know about you, but I sure get that. It's nice to not be confronted with certain things. People actually have to go out of their way to reach out and ruin your day with their politics. No surprise then, 97% of them want to continue some form of remote work after the pandemic has been resolved, one way or another. There are now those, including Dr. Fauci, who think it's not going to end. We're just going to learn to live with it like we did the flu. And that's kind of, I guess that makes sense. But almost all of them want to continue some form of remote work when we get to that place. No surprise. What about the employers, the managers? The first thing management learned was that the lack of commute was among the top reasons employees liked working from home. Many of them were probably offended that their employees didn't want to come see them and work with them day in and day out. When then they found out, it's not you, relax, it's the commute. I hate commuting. And that's no surprise. So I think these executives felt a little bit better. Another good thing, and I don't know about you, but I thought it was great, is that with people not commuting, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions was the same as taking like 600,000 cars off the road. Let's keep doing that. That forestalls the end, and that would be really good. Here's the one that I think is most telling, most important. And if you get nothing else out of today's session, remember this one. Most employees who were working from home just started working when they would ordinarily leave on their commute. Nobody asked them to. Nobody forced them to. Nobody paid them to. It just felt more natural. They just started working. And they would continue working until they would ordinarily get home from work at the end. So if their commute was an hour each way, that was 2 additional hours that the company was enjoying at no additional cost to them. And no additional stress either. They didn't have to demand it or ask for it or cajole anybody. People were just doing it. And it says an awful lot about the work ethic. People misanticipate the work ethic around us. A lot of people have great work ethic, and it was demonstrated in this survey. Now here we get to the 97%. 58% of employees admitted they would start looking for a new job if they were told, yeah, can't keep working from home at all. Matter of fact, 44% know somebody who's already quit their job, and a quarter of them, 24%, almost a quarter of them, would be willing to take a pay cut or lose some vacation time if it meant they could continue working from home. And that's where you start to calculate in that $5,000 or $10,000 savings. They could afford the pay cut because they were saving money. They didn't have to spend money. So that pay cut maybe represented most of the money that they saved. If they get to stay at home, their income doesn't change. Doesn't sound bad to me. So, oh, by the way, the executives themselves, 90% of them expect to work from home. So it's something everybody wants to see happen. What else did they learn? We learned that in total, businesses lose about $600 billion a year to workplace distractions in the office, in the shop floor. $600 billion for people tapping each other on the shoulder. Hey, what do you think of that game? Whatever. $600 billion. We also estimated that remote workers are 35 to 40% more productive than their in-office counterparts. So the employees were right. They were being more productive. They are being more productive. As a matter of fact, the employers acknowledged that, 2/3 of them said that productivity is no different. We didn't lose anything with people going home to work. And a quarter of them said, hey, it's better. Even the employers are recognizing that their employees are more productive when they work from home than when they work in the office. So we're starting to see much more agreement. 51% of the executives report being more productive working from home. I suspect that that's an underestimation. 60% reported being more productive than they thought they would be, which is an interesting thing to think about. And this is my favorite one. On average, they said that their productivity at home was 7% higher than they had expected. I do not know how anybody could have derived that statistic, but there it is. Flex Jobs said this, so I'm just reporting it. And 40% of workers reported being more productive. Again, no surprise. So this is what we have found in the recent studies. Very interesting stuff. Now, let's look into the future. That's what we're here for, right? A look ahead. Even now, 44% of companies won't allow remote work going into the future. 44% that, nope, can't do it. But 85% of the managers working in those companies see it as the new normal. They fully expect that they're going to continue working from home. It's the new normal. So there seems to be some discord between the companies and those who work as managers in those companies. And that'll be interesting to see how that develops. 16% of companies already have announced that they're not coming back. Everybody's now, if you remember back at the very beginning of the pandemic, I reported that Twitter had announced that they're done. They're not coming back to the office. Twitter will now all work from home. All employees will always work from home. There will be offices for them to come to if they want to, conference rooms for them to use if they need them, but they're expected to work from home from now on. And plenty of companies followed suit right away, even more. We're only at 16% now, but you can expect that number to skyrocket. I see that number going higher and higher and higher. This is an estimate that I think also will go higher and higher and higher. 40% of companies will have hybrid workers. What's a hybrid worker? A hybrid worker is one who works from home sometimes and works from the office at other times. Now, how do they decide where to work? It's whichever one makes more sense. I mean, not for nothing, but sometimes it makes sense to go to the office because there are resources there that you need to use. Sometimes it makes sense because there are people that you really want to get together with, and you feel the need to be in their presence so you can persuade them. Edward Hall defined a whole science of proxemics that talked about the impact it has depending on how close or far we stand from each other. How close are you to the person? You know, the concept of close talkers. Sometimes you feel the need to be a close talker, and you can't do that over video with a phone, so you go to the office. And you're disappointed when you find out the person you wanted to get close to stayed home. That'll happen. So 40% of companies say they'll have hybrid workers. They know they're going to. And the other 60% are going to find out that indeed they will, because the workers want to, their managers want to, that this number's going to rise. Bottom line. The bottom line is that remote work is here to stay. This is undeniable. We see it in the numbers. It makes sense. It made sense 28 years ago. It makes even more sense today. So remote work is here to stay. What are we going to see start to happen as we move into this new time? Well, the first one I've already kind of alluded to is the big quit, or the great resignation, as some people like to call it. I chose this visual because it's a positive visual. The message being that smoking can weaken your immune system, make you more susceptible to COVID, so you should quit now. It's a good time to quit smoking. But the big quit that we're talking about refers to people threatening that they're going to leave their job if they don't get to work from home anymore. They really like it. And in the Gallup poll, 54% of employees who are currently working remotely, at least some of the time, say they would ideally like to split their time between working at home and in the office. That's the definition of hybrid. More than half want to continue doing that. More than half admitted that they would prefer to do that. As a matter of fact, 37%, more than a third, said they just want to work from home. They don't want to go back to the office at all. And only 9% want to work in the office full time. My assumption is that 9% either have horrible marriages or young children who are very noisy. And I love young children who are very noisy, so don't think I don't. But that's the way the numbers lay out right now. And again, I expect that we're going to see more and more people prefer to work from home sometimes, at the office sometimes. It makes the most sense, the most flexibility, and people should have that kind of flexibility. That's that thing about taking a pay cut. USA Today found that half of workers they spoke to would be willing to take a pay cut of up to 5% if they could continue working remotely, at least part-time. Half. Think about that for a second. Half, and for those of you who are managers and employers, your employees, half of them would take a pay cut. Food for thought. 25% said they'd leave. If they couldn't work remotely, they'd leave. And as a matter of fact, last August, the first round of numbers came in. 4.3 million people did just that. That was the Great Resignation. That's where it began. People just leaving their jobs saying, no, if I can't work from home, I don't want to work here anymore, because there are plenty of companies that are willing to employ me and let me work from home. And as a matter of fact, then we go to the concept of the Zoom meetings or Teams meetings. A lot of people complaining, oh, it's not the same when you're on video. Well, 70% of those surveyed by USA Today said they found them less stressful. They liked virtual meetings, much easier to handle. And if you manage them correctly, if you have a good protocol for keeping everybody from talking over each other, virtual meetings can be very productive because you don't really hang out and chew the fat afterwards. So anyway, interesting statistics, but 70% are happy with virtual meetings. Half of them would take a pay cut. So the big question becomes, how do we avoid the big quit? How do we keep our people from leaving us just because we won't let them work from home? And the answer is simple. That's the thing about this. It's a simple, straightforward answer, and the degree of difficulty in achieving it will vary. Your results may be different. Basically, what we want to do is give people what they need to be successful. If we're measuring based on what they need to be successful, well then, ostensibly, we don't care where they work. We just care that they get the work done. Let's dive a little bit deeper into this. The concept, and many of you probably experienced this in management school, they tell you to manage the whole person. You're not managing an employee. You're managing a human being. A human being has plenty more than just work problems. People are emotional. They have things going on in their lives, especially now with 900,000 people dying. That's 900,000 families that contain people with emotional duress. Some of them are very likely working for you. You need to be cognizant of that. You need to work with that. You need to help them in important ways. People have difficulty dealing with other people. They have interpersonal problems. And you need to play referee in some cases. You need to help people understand that they're communicating less effectively than they could. And perhaps you can help them with, be more effective. They have professional issues. They want to know, am I moving along my growth path? Some may have physical. Some may get sick themselves and need to deal with how do they keep their job while they're sick. They all want to make more money, so wealth is important to them. And they all have environmental and mental issues that they have to contend with. And the way they interact with their world. This is all part of managing. I mean, managing all of that is managing people. It's never been more important. And it's also never been more challenging because you won't be physically with them as much. So we really need to take a good hard look at that. And I suggest to you that the first way to do that is to see your company as a community. Going back to that slide we saw of the folks from Zoom having their party. Actually, that slide's coming up. You want people to feel that they're part of a community. You want people to feel that the people they work with are family, friends, on their side. And so you need to do everything you can to promote the concept of the company as community. That may take the form of company newsletters, company gatherings, or there's all kinds of possibilities. You also have to contend with that whole farmer's shadow thing and lose it. Here's some of the things that the executives have learned during this period of time. The first is that the most important element is trust. You have to trust that your employees are going to be working when they work from home, and they're not going to be goofing off, and they're not going to be doing something else. They're not going to be watching soap operas or football games or what have you. You need to be able to trust in that. And similarly, employees need to be able to trust their managers, that the managers will take care of them, that they'll continue to employ them even though they're working from home. Many people are afraid that if they're not there to lobby their manager, they're going to lose ground with their manager. That's got to go. They've got to be able to talk with you and know and feel confident that their employment will continue. Basically, this says that you need to manage the outcomes, not the clock. It's kind of a simple concept. If somebody clocked in at 9 and clocked out at 5 and sat there doing nothing all day, there are managers who would say, they clocked in, they clocked out, everything's good. Because they're not looking at what the employee did or did not do. Similarly, if they clocked in from home at 9, clocked out at 5, the manager doesn't know. It looks good. Still, there's no information there. If, on the other hand, the manager said, I need these outcomes from you today, and at the end of the day, that employee said, okay, I achieved those outcomes, the manager got what they asked for. If they didn't ask for enough, they'll ask for more tomorrow. You tend to adjust. But let's recognize that growth and success are not measured by time spent. They're measured by results. Quite frankly, it's the reason that I took the title Senior Resultant for myself. I'm all about results. I had people come tell me how hard they tried when I was a manager. And I appreciate the effort. It doesn't help me. Only results speak. They don't speak louder. They're the only thing that speak. So if we're managing results, if we're measuring results, that's the true reflection of what our people are doing. Now, what that means is that they need some way of telling us that they've achieved their results. And here's where we start to talk about technology. Workflow automation technology is fantastic. It's a great way to track the daily achievement of the goals you set for your people. It's also a good way to communicate those goals. They come to their workflow automation system, they get their assignments, they go about doing them, and they report their completions. Terrific. You get all the data you need. You even get some data about how long it took from beginning to end. So you can see how much time they're putting into it. And you can compare that from task to task, or you can compare it from person to person to see who your most productive, most efficient people are. It's all there. The data is all there. You just need to measure it and put away the time clock. Pull out the workflow automation system and see if you can't get what you really need working that way. They also learned 3 very important lessons that I want to make sure I emphasize during this session. Lesson number 1, celebrate often. Celebrate the great things your people do. And do that in public. Praise them publicly as you can. It's important that people feel good about the job they're doing. If your employees feel good, you're more than halfway to making your customers feel good. If the employee experience is great, you've got a much better chance of establishing a great customer experience. So that is something you desperately want to do. And the other part of that is criticize pragmatically. What do I mean? I mean, tell somebody, okay, what I needed you to accomplish was this, and you didn't accomplish that. Here's what you did that I don't think you should have done. You might have done better if you'd done it this way. Criticize the activity. Criticize what was done. It's a lot better than saying, you idiot, you failed me again. I think that's vivid enough. That's useless. That just sets people against you, and quite frankly, they should become part of that 54% who want to quit. That's just not a way to manage people. Okay, here we finally come to that slide that I was alluding to before. I love this picture. These are all employees of Zoom. This is a photograph from Zoom of a party that they held. So when we're, celebrating frequently, praising publicly, criticizing pragmatically, also party heartily. It's good to have your people come together and celebrate and feel good about each other and feel good about being a team. And there's nothing that replaces that. I heard recently about one of the popular online food service companies. They've introduced a new service. From one place, you can order lunch for as many people as you want in as many places as you want. So if you have locations all over the country, you can order lunch for everybody. They will coordinate delivering the lunches so they all basically arrive at pretty much the same time, in time for you to have a lunch meeting with everybody. You get them here on Zoom. They've all got lunch in front of them. Hey, let's have lunch together. I think that that's one of the most brilliant programs anybody's introduced during this horrible pandemic. So let's take advantage of it. Okay, this is the part I think you've all been waiting for, the part where we get to talk about the toys. I'm sorry, I didn't mean toys. I meant the tools. The tools and platforms that we're going to use to achieve all these things. Tools. Okay, first and foremost, I want to deal with the concept of best of breed versus best of platform. There's a big change we're undergoing right now. Those of us, anybody who's sitting out there who is a technologist, an engineer, knows you have tools that you love, tools you've been using probably for years. They are your favorites. They're your preferred tools to use. Unfortunately, the guy next to you may not know, or the gal next to you may not know how to use that tool. And if they're going to use it, you're going to have to teach them, or they're going to have to learn on their own. And then if you're using another tool, you have to learn that tool. And another, you have to learn that tool. Before long, you're taking a lot of training and getting support from a lot of different places. It's all kind of disconnected, disjointed. And inevitably, you end up creating cracks through which things can slip. And over time, recently, we realized even if the tools are the best of breed each, that's not the best possible solution in a production environment. The better solution is a platform that brings together all the tools you need to accomplish a certain thing, like managing the network or managing workflow or what have you. Best of platform means some of the tools may not be your favorite, but they're perfectly usable. And the best news is they're seamless. They're built to be integrated. They're integrated by nature. And so my recommendation is start looking for best of platform rather than continuing to identify best of breed tools. For those of you who are open platform houses, open source houses, yeah, I know this is like against your religion, and I apologize for that. But the reality is that we're seeing people at all levels of experience. And they're joining, and especially now with 4 million job recs open around the world for IT people, we need to be in a condition where new people can come in and learn how to fix everything in one training, one support operation. So look for best of platform rather than best of breed. In space, no one can hear you scream. No. In the cloud, everyone is equal. Now, those of you who had people working from home and working in the office know that the people in the office had direct connection to the LAN, the local area network. They got terrific response times. People out there on the LAN, it really depended on how they were accessing. Over the internet, there's latency, there's all kinds of unpredictability. Even on long lines, it's going to take longer. They're going to get a slower response than they did in the office. Now, of course, everybody's remote. Everybody gets the same responsiveness. So the name of the game is improve that responsiveness and float all boats, right? All boats rise. And there are many ways we're going to do that. Again, companies we've spoken to that were already in the cloud, using the cloud extensively, had a much easier time back in March of 2020 making their migration to work from home. In the cloud, everyone needs equal protection. Well, we need to keep them all secure at every level. That means that authentication has to improve. It means that encryption has to improve, firewalls, intrusion prevention systems, everything that we do to secure our data and our networks and our people has to work similarly for everybody. For that reason, we're seeing the emergence of SASE, right? Secure Access Service Edge, where we've combined both the network operation and the security operation into one. SASE brings together all the best of networking and all the best of security. It starts with software-defined wide area networking, and it includes things like bandwidth aggregation from various different kinds of circuits so that you're using the most cost-effective route every time. It uses multiple networking vendors, so you have redundancy. If one fails, you still can fail over to another. You're seeing everything as a service, firewall as a service, network as a service. You're seeing, well, what you're seeing mainly, like I said, SD-WAN, zero trust, where nothing is trusted. Everything must prove itself. Everything must confirm itself. Zero trust also no longer focuses only on IP addresses and other technical specifications. Now there's real focus on who is accessing the network and what device are they using. Both must be verified before they can connect to the network. And that's got a lot more powerful, serious implications than simply checking IP addresses, which can be spoofed. We're using cloud access security brokers. We'd better be using multi-factor authentication. There's no reason not to anymore. You don't have to buy a bunch of little fobs to do it. Everybody's doing it with their mobile phone, and it makes all the sense in the world. And we're using secure web gateways. The message here is that everything we're doing is designed for distributed computing, people being wherever they are, under centralized control so that you're not duplicating everything all over the place. That would be unmanageable. Now, central control, distributed computing, we're preparing for a world in which everybody may be working from somewhere other than corporate headquarters. No discussion of this would be complete without at least a mention of 5G. I would refresh and remind everybody. 5G is not 5G is not 5G. The way that AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, Sprint, the way they each approach 5G is somewhat different from each other. So you're going to see different deployments. You're going to see different services, different availabilities. You're going to need to get to work harder to get a good definition of what you're getting. They're already offering 5G home internet, meaning they're going to put you on a MiFi, right? There's a lot to be learned, but what is promised is increased bandwidth, which is great, increased speed, which is great, and elimination of latency. So if any of you are planning on getting a self-driven car, an autonomic vehicle, this is important. Because if your autonomic vehicle suddenly loses connection in the midst of a left turn, that's what we call an accident, or in the Midwest, a wreck, a crash. It's not a good thing. Elimination of latency has a lot of implications to it, and we're going to see those start to roll out as the next few years go by and 5G matures, the same way that 4G LTE matured. It took a long time. Remember that it took a long time, and be patient with 5G as it comes out. When it does, we can look forward to incredible improvements in things like artificial intelligence. The responsiveness of artificial intelligence will be completely redefined in a world with more bandwidth and no latency. Mobility will be completely redefined. There's no reason to think you're going to have poor performance anywhere as 5G matures. And of course, we're going to see a redefinition of the Internet of Things. All those millions and billions of sensors and switches and whatnot, They're going to have even better access, faster access, more responsiveness. We're going to see new applications coming out because we can do them now where we couldn't do them before. So 5G is on its way. Be patient, and let's see just how it rolls out. Which brings us finally to applications. And the first and foremost one I want to talk about is workflow automation. Okay, this is what we're going to use to allow everybody working from wherever they are to get their assignments and to report on their completion of their assignments so we can measure everything they're doing without having to physically be there casting a shadow over them. We're also going to see an explosion of low-code, no-code. Okay, most people are allergic to the idea of coding. Those of you who are developers, you know it's wonderful, gives you unbelievable capability, flexibility. There's more great stuff coming all the time, but the typical person does not want to have to contend with that. They should be in an environment where if they know their work process, they can interpret that work process into a low-code, no-code application simply by shifting tiles around an interface on the screen. No coding or very little coding at all. And if you think this is isolated, if you think this is kind of like a remote thing that's just kind of happening here and there, these are only some of the products that are emerging that allow you to do low-code, no-code. There are tons more. I couldn't fit them all on the screen. This is big. And this is something that if you haven't started exploring it, you probably want to do so now because it's going to put a lot more power into your hands in terms of what your technology can do for you. Think of a self-styled digital transformation every day. Fun. Then we get to that popularly referred to collaboration. This being the model, we want to see everybody on the same page, contributing their ideas and their creativity, and that's what it should look like. And there are plenty of products out there and more emerging all the time. Popular ones include Microsoft Teams, which Microsoft is doing what it always does. It's cramming more and more functionality all the time. You've got to keep up with it. You've got to keep up with the complexity that it creates. There's more training to be had. But, with great power comes great responsibility. Thank you, Uncle Ben. Zoom jumped into popularity with the pandemic, and they just keep on growing and growing their platform. Other platforms like RingCentral are continuing to expand the UCaaS universe, as is 8x8 and Nextiva and many, many others. So these are all saying they all work together. Explore those integrations. Remember to always include something that gives you a productivity suite. Google Workplace is a good example, Microsoft 365. Again, integration is key. If all your applications are naturally integrated, it's easier to make things work together to give you more capability than you'd have otherwise. There are also many platforms like Trello or Monday or Workforce or Slack that allow you to manage people's productivity and manage their projects, manage their activity. So there are great applications enabling all kinds of collaboration to take place. Finally, I'm going to break down and get back to toys. Yeah, I did kind of mean it. The toys are pretty cool, and the toys that are emerging are even cooler. This is what we look like right now, right? This is your typical user. He's got his one hand on his mouse, got a keyboard in front of him, he's got a monitor, he's got his tablet laying there on the and those look like game cartridges, but I won't say anything. This is a typical user, comfy chair, some audio, terrific. What a great place to work. It's going to get better. Even now, virtual reality replaces reality. Put on the headset, like a Meta Quest 2 headset, good example. Those of us in the business interpret that to be Facebook Quest 2. You put the headset on and reality goes away, replaced with a completely different reality, other than the one you're used to. And you can be in a war zone. You can be in space. You could be on a roller coaster. You could be on the beach, just by putting on the headset. Then there's augmented reality. Augmented reality basically puts digital information on top of the real world. So you can look at a street through your mobile device, and you can see buttons that show you where everything is. There's a watch shop ahead of you and a restaurant. You can click on those and see the menu for that restaurant or the menu for that coffee shop, more information about each of these places. Augmented reality imposes digital content on your real world. Now, that may not strike you as a very practical application, but this will. Tony Stark, Iron Man's advisor, right? Tony Stark is in there. He has targeting available to him, threat assessment. He sees what kind of weapons are being tossed at him. He can evaluate things going on in the atmosphere. All that data presented to him as he flies. Now, which of us doesn't want to have that functionality? And then finally, there's mixed reality. Mixed reality adds digital, virtual elements to the real world, but these are now elements you can interact with. This engineer, for example, is rotating this motor in space in front of him, even though it's not there. So he can see where things might bind or things might jam. It improves his ability to detect problems before they happen. So mixed reality, you've got things in the world that you can move around. It is conceivable that mixed reality may replace monitors someday, where you can have as many monitors as you want. You just create them in front of you using your visor. There's a lot coming, and it really depends on who's developing what. Ultimately, hopefully, by the time the Jedi become popular, we will have the ability to attend meetings as an astral projection. This is a Jedi Council meeting, and of course, one person, I don't know what he is, couldn't make it, so he showed up virtually as a hologram. This is already possible. This is already happening. So look forward to it becoming popularly available very soon. And then finally, there's the concept of spare parts. Parts is parts, right? This is an ocular and an auditory implant, something that is surgically implanted into your head, connects to your auditory and ocular nerve, and lets you see and hear things that are sent to you digitally. You don't need a monitor. You don't need a visor. You don't need a headset. It's all there. This is also in use today and will be popularly available pretty soon. And of course, hearing and sight are not the only things we can today augment. There's a variety of other things. Okay, we can insert all kinds of things into the human body to assist various important functions. Artificial legs, artificial limbs, an artificial heart, an RFID tag so you can identify somebody simply by scanning them, automated drug delivery so that they don't have to worry about taking their pills every morning, bionic eyes, so yeah, you can be this $6 million person, all kinds of things. Now, some of you are sitting there saying, oh, come on, this is silly. It's not silly. This visual comes from the Institute of Electric and Electronic Engineers, the IEEE, the de facto authority on all things technology, advancing technology for humanity. This is their graphic. This is their projection of the very near future. With that, we still have a couple of minutes. John, if you have any questions, boy, I'd love to answer them.
Sure. Thank you, Howard. Party heartily. Good to know something I learned in college as real-world application. So we're going to get to the questions now. There's just a little bit of time here, but you can take your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Let's see. Here's one from David, and he's wondering, how recent is this data for flex jobs? It seems
Yeah.
like as time goes on, some of the attitudes have changed.
Well, this is about a year old, and I was not able to find a more recent survey, but circa about a year ago, and I agree with you, David. I think that, this is going to change daily. So this was the best that I could pull for this presentation, but there'll be updates all the time.
Okay, here's another one from Victoria. Are there any downsides to hiring people from faraway places if you don't expect them to come into the office?
Okay, I'm the wrong guy to ask. I've been hiring people from faraway places for decades. Seriously, I've been using remote tools to manage customer networks since 1998. It's a long time. We always use remote tools, and we always hired people wherever they happen to be, because it's their knowledge, that we're looking for. It's not their physical presence. And if you think about if any of you watched the Star Trek Picard series on Paramount, they just turned him into a digital being with all of Picard's memories and processing capabilities. That's not far off. That was first introduced in Battlestar Galactica, the newer series. It's not pie in the sky. We're getting very close to the point where we can basically copy your memory, which I'm told is only about 300 gigabytes, and your processing capability into silicon. Once we can go from carbon to silicon, all bets are off. But even now, I don't think you need a person to be there to do knowledge work, informational work. If there's physical work involved, obviously they have to be where you are.
Howard, I think we're out of time here. That was an information-packed session. I appreciate everybody's input. We're going to take a short break now. Thank you, Howard M. Cohen, for a great session. And our sponsors, Martello, Splashtop, Okta, RingCentral, and Smarsh for making it possible. We're going to take a short break, be back right around the top of the hour, probably just a few minutes after, for our second session, New Remote Workforce Best Practices for 2022, presented by scientist, author, and 20-time Microsoft MVP, Brian Posey, and moderated by my colleague, Converge 360 Associate Web Editor and winner of our last company-wide trivia game, Chris Paoli. Beat me by a hair. I know it's going to be another informative session, so stay tuned. Now would be a good time to check out those resources on your console provided by our sponsors. And remember, during today's third session, we will be giving away a pair of AirPods Max, Apple's high-end wireless over-ear headphones. So stay tuned. Bye for now.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course our sponsors, Martello, Splashtop, Okta, RingCentral, and Smarsh for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Chris Paoli, Associate Editor, and I am here to moderate the second session of our What's Ahead for Your Remote Workforce in 2022 Summit. This session is called New Remote Workforce Best Practices for 2022. Our speaker for this session is Brian Posey, Microsoft's MVP and technology writer. Brian Posey is a freelance technology author and a 20-time Microsoft MVP. Throughout his career, Brian has written or contributed to dozens of IT books, has created numerous full-length video training courses, and has published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of these blog posts can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column or in his new Posey's Moonshot column, both found on redmondmag.com. Take it away, Brian.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. So, whereas the previous presentation covered the future of remote work and all of the things that we might expect in the not-too-distant future, my presentation is going to focus more on the here and now. So, in other words, what is the state of the world? What's the state of remote work? And what should we be doing differently than what we're doing at the moment? So I've got a ton of information that I'm going to try to present in this session, and a lot of this is based on my own personal experiences. So it should be a fun session. So one of the big takeaways that I want to convey is that The pandemic will eventually run its course. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Because if you look back at history, every plague, no matter how bad it was, did eventually run its course at some point. That was true for the Black Death that ravaged Europe back in the Middle Ages. It was true for the Spanish flu 100 years ago. And this will end too at some point in time. Having said that, though, what may not end is remote work. And there are any number of reasons for that. One of the big reasons is that a lot of users probably prefer working from home, I myself included. I walked away from my corporate job way back in 2000, and I've been working from home for the last 22 years. And if I'm to be totally honest with you, I cannot imagine ever going back to a situation where I have to work in an office each day. Working from home is great. There's no putting on the dress clothes, there's no commute to deal with, and there are any number of other advantages, not to mention that it's more easy to deal with the distractions of day-to-day life. You don't have to worry if somebody needs to be there to sign for a package or if you've got to be there to let a plumber in or something like that. If you're working from home, those types of things become a non-issue. So working from home definitely has its advantages. No, it's not perfect. There are advantages to going to the office as well. But I think when all is said and done, there are going to be an awful lot of people that really prefer to continue to work from home. Now, it's not just the users who can benefit from work from home. It's also businesses. And there are a couple of ways of looking at this. One thing is that back in 2020, when the world shut down, businesses invested a lot of money and a lot of resources in remote access technologies that would allow users to work from home. And they're not going to be anxious to walk away from that investment just because the world is slowly starting to go back to normal. They're going to want to capitalize and see a return on that investment that they made. So I don't really see businesses walking away from their remote access technologies. Another thing to look at from a business perspective is that companies are starting to realize how much money they're saving by utilizing remote work. Not only does it cut down on employee absenteeism, there's also things like reduced use of utilities that businesses are no longer having to pay for because users aren't in the office. Also, a lot of organizations have completely eliminated their physical real estate presence, so they've unleashed themselves from an expensive lease on a commercial property. So businesses are saving a fortune, thereby making them more profitable and enticing them to continue the remote work trend. So all of that is to say that I really don't think that remote work is going to go anywhere, at least not anytime soon. So that being the case, I think that it makes a lot of sense to take a step back and take a look at what's working with regard to remote work and what maybe we could be doing better. Now, one of the things that I wanted to point out about remote work is that, yes, it's been a major disruptor for IT, especially given how suddenly it was sprung on all of us, but it's certainly not the only disruptor. The entire history of IT has been filled with one disruptor after another, and it really seems like that's kind of accelerated over about the last 15 or 20 years. I've listed a few of the more major disruptors on the slide, things like the so-called bring-your-own-device revolution, the transition to the cloud, the dot-com revolution, wireless networking. I know that sounds weird as a disruptor, but that's one of those things I'm going to talk a little bit more about later on. Server virtualization, and the list goes on and on. Now, the important thing to keep in mind with these, and something I'm sure that anybody who is involved in any of these trends will remember, is that it didn't go smoothly at first. There were some road bumps along the way, and maybe it took a couple of tries to really get it right and to form policies and that sort of thing that made these particular transitions practical. So, as I said a moment ago, the key thing to do right now is to just kind of take a step back and see what's working and what maybe we need to be doing something different about. Because when the pandemic first happened, the world shut down seemingly overnight. Realistically, it was probably more like a week. But the directive toward a lot of IT people was just make it work. I don't care how you do it, just make it work and get it done quick. And I like to think that the IT community delivered on that. We really pulled off something amazing, and anybody who was directly involved in that, you should congratulate yourself. Now, having said that, remote work solutions were put into place hastily out of a matter of necessity. I mean, granted, most organizations already had some remote capabilities, but those had to be scaled up very, very rapidly. The thing about it is, at the time, nobody really cared because everybody expected the whole remote work thing to be temporary. But now, it seems like remote work, or at the very least hybrid work, is here to stay for a while. So it's really important to take a step back and consider what works and what doesn't. So what types of things should you be looking at? Well, honestly, probably everything, but to be more practical, some of the things that you should be considering are user satisfaction, which seems like a weird thing to put at the top of the list, but in my mind, it's one of the most important things because your users are the ones who actually do the company's work. And if they're not happy, the company just really doesn't run all that well. So it's important to keep your users happy. So user satisfaction is an important thing to look at. Other important things to look at might include security, support, compliance, data backups, and work-life balance. And I'm going to be delving into all of these a little bit more as we go along, some a little bit deeper than others. And at the bottom of the slide, you'll notice that I've got any other area where IT has influence or authority. That one's a bit vague, admittedly, but it kind of falls into the category of every organization is different. Every organization has its own way of doing things. So there might be some things that are unique to your organization that wouldn't necessarily make it onto my list. This is just an acknowledgement of that you should take a look at any aspect that IT has a lot of control over and just see if it's really living up to what it needs to be able to do. So with that said, let's turn our attention toward user satisfaction. When it comes to measuring user satisfaction and ensuring that the users are happy, there are a number of questions that need to be considered. The very first question on the list is, do the users have what they need in order to do their jobs? So this might be anything from computing hardware to a decent internet connection or what have you. It's just important to make sure that the users have what they need and that if there is some need that's not being met, that something's done to address that need. Another question, is remote work getting in the way of productivity? So, in other words, were users able to work more efficiently when they were at the office, or are they working more efficiently at home? Now, if it's the former and users were more efficient when they were at the office, then the big question becomes, what can we be doing to ensure that users work just as efficiently at their home office, assuming that you want to continue on with remote work? And that's actually a point that I'm going to be coming back to in a few slides. The next question on the list, is the solution worse than the problem? And I've seen so many examples of this as the time has gone on. For example, people who really didn't attend that many meetings when they were working on site, but now it seems like they're so bombarded with one Zoom meeting after another, that it's hard for them to even find time to get their work done because they're tied up in meetings all day long, whereas before the pandemic, meetings were a rarity. So you have to consider, is the solution worse than the problem? And if so, what can be done to remedy that? And then the last point on the slide, and this one's kind of a personal pet peeve of mine, is the technology being used in an abusive way? Is it being used to spy on users or to regulate a user's home office layout or things like that? There have been so many examples of this. I'm not going to call anybody out specifically, but there was one organization that got caught using webcams to spy on users while they were at home. There was another organization that I read about a while back, and for the life of me, I can't remember who it was, that was actually trying to craft HR policy around users' homes. So they were trying to control things like how much square footage you have to dedicate to your home office, what types of items you're required to have in your home, what you're not allowed to have in your home, how high your desk is supposed to be, and the list goes on with all these insidious regulations. So those are just a few things to think about with regard to user satisfaction. So what about some best practices? Because this session is, after all, new remote workforce best practices for 2022. Well, one best practice is to ask the users for feedback, but don't pester them with endless surveys. So I think that most users probably like being occasionally asked what they think about things, especially if they honestly believe that change may result from things that aren't working for them. But that feedback really loses its meaning if you don't listen or if you're just constantly bombarding users with surveys and opinion questions and things like that. Because it's one thing to maybe get a survey a couple of times a year. It's another thing entirely to get a survey every single week or every few days, asking the same things that the users have already been asked over and over and over again. I remember doing a research project in college that involved having to send out a few series of surveys. And when I sent out the first round, I got tons of responses, but as time went on, I got fewer and fewer responses, presumably because people were getting tired of all of the questioning. The second point on the slide is actually listen to what the users are telling you, even if it isn't what you want to hear. Again, I'm not going to go too deeply into this one, but I will say that I once worked for an organization that used user feedback as a way to justify whatever it was that they were planning on doing anyway. And if the user suggested something that was counter to that, then they just ignored that feedback and pretended it never happened. That's obviously a terrible way to run a business. So if you're going to ask users for feedback, then take to heart whatever it is that they suggest, even if it isn't necessarily what you were expecting or what you wanted to hear. And then the last point on the slide is don't neglect one-off situations. And by one-off situations, I'm talking about special needs that maybe only apply to one user or a handful of users or something like that. And I'll give you a really personal example of that. Early in my IT career, I worked as a network admin for a large insurance company. And back then, this was the mid-90s, the process of creating user accounts and provisioning new users and all that was a completely manual process. Well, in the insurance industry, there's something called open enrollments. And that's a time of year when people are allowed to make changes to their policies. And it's a really busy period. The company in question was hiring hundreds and hundreds of temp workers to handle the open enrollment demand. And so naturally, the IT department had to create user accounts for all of those users. So because it was a manual process, it was a monumental effort. It involved a couple days of us doing nothing but creating one user account after another after another. And at the time, me being in my early 20s at the time, I was into a lot of extreme sports, and without going into too much detail, I had broken my arm pretty badly and had just gotten out of a cast. And typing was pretty painful at that point. Well, the organization ended up getting me a special ergonomic keyboard that greatly alleviated some of that pain. And even though I could have done the job with a regular keyboard, having that special keyboard made me so much more productive than I would have been with a regular keyboard because it helped me to be able to type more quickly. So all of that is to say don't neglect those special one-off situations when it comes to user satisfaction. Sometimes a small gesture like that can really go a long way. So what are some more best practices? Well, one best practice is to consider, do the users want to use their own hardware? Users tend to know what works best for their own productivity. And if a user has a particular device form factor that they want to work from, then there's a very good chance that that's going to help them. Now, of course, the opposite can be true. We all know that there are some device form factors that really don't work well towards certain job situations. For example, if you've got a user who is responsible for data entry, you probably don't want them working from a touch keyboard on a smartphone all day long. That's probably not going to be the most efficient way of them working. Another consideration is the user-supplied hardware up to the job? Now, this one has implications both with support and with security. From a security perspective, there are certain older devices that just can't be hardened quite the way that some of the newer ones are. So that's an important consideration. But you also have to think about what this is going to do to your support department. There are some devices that realistically you just can't support. To give you another personal example, a couple of years ago, I had a friend who really isn't into computers at all and doesn't really know anything about them. They called me and told me, hey, I just bought my first computer. Can you come over and help me set it up? So we worked out a time. I went over to their house, and they ended up buying, and I kid you not, they got a 286 at a yard sale and wanted to begin using it to get on the internet and do all kinds of other fun things. So that was an example of a support situation in which aging hardware just wasn't up to the job. So another question, does the user have adequate internet access? And if not, why? Well, if you find that a user doesn't have adequate internet access, it could be that it's simply just a matter of budgeting. Maybe the user doesn't have the household budget for a decent internet package, and that might be something that the organization can help with. On the other hand, it's equally possible that the user lives in an area where something like that just isn't available. That was actually the case for me for quite some time. Up until maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, I kind of lost track of the time, but the area where I live is serviced by a rural carrier, and they're the only option for internet. And I was limited to 384 kilobits per second of internet connectivity speed up until really just a few years ago. So there was no other option at that time. So what about some more best practices? Well, a moment ago, I had made the point that one of the things that you have to consider is whether remote work is getting in the way of the user's productivity, if they would normally be more productive in the office. and if that's the case, what you can do to make the remote environment more conducive to the user being able to efficiently work. Well, one of the best practices that I kind of take along with that is to remember any productivity lessons that you might have learned while working on the road. Now, I know some people travel a lot more than others, and in my own life, I'm one of those people that travels constantly, or especially before the pandemic, but even today, I still tend to travel quite a bit. Some of that is for spaceflight training, some of it's for IT events, some of it's personal. Either way, there's a lot of travel, and very often I find myself having to work on the road. And one of the lessons that really sticks out in my mind is that when I'm at home, I have a desk that I've got set up where I've got quite a few monitors just wrapped around me, basically, and it allows me to work very efficiently because I can have different things on different monitors. And I've realized that when I travel, just having a laptop doesn't let me work anywhere nearly as efficiently as I normally would. Well, the last time that Microsoft had its Ignite conference in person, I realized that I had a lot of content that was due that week, but I still had to attend the conference, so I needed to force myself to work as efficiently as I could, even though I was going to be doing that work from a hotel room. So I actually brought along a couple of external monitors and a docking station for my laptop, and I made the setup as similar as I could to what I have at home. And yes, it was a pain to have to drag all that in from the car and set it up in a hotel room, but ultimately that extra effort really paid off in terms of productivity. It did exactly what I needed it to. So this is an example of what I am talking about productivity lessons that may have been learned from the road. So consider things that you may have had to have done when you're working in a less than optimal environment to boost your own productivity, and maybe some of those same techniques or variations of them can be applied to your end users. So let's transition and talk a little bit about support. Now, support could easily be lumped in with user satisfaction, but there are aspects of support that are kind of unique, so I wanted to address that as a completely separate category. One of the big things to keep in mind with support is that remote work has completely done away with conventional office hours. Users tend to work at all hours of the day or at night, and so it's important to make sure that support is available at the times when the users are working, even if that's 24/7. But another consideration is that after-hour support can't be subpar. It needs to be just as good as what's available during the day. I can think of incidents where I've had to call a support line late at night because of something that I'm working on, and I've had people tell me, oh, you'll have to wait for the day shift because only they have access to do such and such, or things like that. And it's infuriating when you're trying to get a job done and support can't help you because they don't have the necessary knowledge or authority to do what it is that you need done. So the big takeaway there is that after-hour support needs to be just as good as the support that you have during business hours. And also, you don't want to put your IT staff in a situation where they have to field support calls in the middle of the night. Let them work during their shift and have somebody else late at night. I can't help but think about when I was in college. I was going to school full-time and working full-time in IT. And usually by the time all of that was done, it was about 11 o'clock at night before I got home. And I can remember a few times getting home and having messages on my answering machine, hey, we need you to come back in when you get done with school because so-and-so's computer needs attention. And believe me when I say that was no fun at all. So just make sure that support is adequately covered. And it looks like one slide accidentally got duplicated and one of my slides is missing, but the point that I had intended to make on this slide was that when it comes to support, you also need to think about security, because if you've got users working remotely, you need a way of authenticating that they are who they claim to be once they contact your support department. Now, organizations have adopted all different ways of doing this. For example, a lot of organizations will ask the caller a security question, or they might send a code to their smartphone and have them verify the code or something like that. And that's all a good start. But one of the important things to consider is that you have to be smart about the way that you authenticate a user's identity when they call the support desk. Because you don't want to accidentally authenticate somebody who's trying to use a social engineering scam as a way of gaining access to your organization. But you also don't want to give the help desk technician too much information or more authority than they really need. So one example of that is, let's suppose that an organization uses a security challenge question to verify a user. So the user calls into the help desk. The technician asks them their challenge question. They give them the answer. Well, at that point, that technician knows the answer to that user's question. Might not necessarily be a big deal in every situation, but think about other ways in which that information could be put to work. So you've got to be able to trust your help desk technicians, but you also have to be really smart about the types of information that you put in their hands. So let's talk a little bit about security. One of the things about remote work is that it's drastically changed the threat landscape. Now, some of the threats that we're facing today have been there for a long time, but there may also be some new ones. One example of a threat that's been around for a long time is ransomware, but it's drastically increased in this day and age of remote work. I saw something a few days ago that in 2020, after all of the lockdowns and everything, that successful ransomware attacks had increased by 150% that year. And there were an estimated 67,000 successful ransomware attacks, I believe it said. And I've also seen statistics for last year. Now, admittedly, some of these statistics are contradictory from one another, so I'm not really sure which one is right. But they all point to the same basic thing, that ransomware attacks have increased dramatically last year, even over the year before, which was a big increase over the year before that. The point being that remote work has increased a number of different security threats, and those threats have to be taken seriously. So you're going to need to adapt your security accordingly. So the number one best practice that I could give you with regard to this is to completely disregard the idea of the network perimeter. Because if you think about it, in the old days of IT, we all worked in these environments where everything was confined within four walls. All of our devices were domain-joined desktops that never left the organization. Our servers were right there in the data center on site, and our users came into the building to work. So if we could keep the bad guys from penetrating those four walls, we were doing a really good job with security. Today, that concept is null and void. It just doesn't work anymore. Because if you think about it, devices are mobile, users are working from home, and most of our applications are running in the cloud, not in the corporate data center. So the perimeter has completely evaporated. So we need new ways to look at defenses. Two recommendations that I would make is, one, move toward a zero trust model. That's something that hopefully you're already doing, but zero trust is one of those things where it's more of an idea than, say, a product or a procedure or something like that. There are always ways that you can improve upon your existing zero trust initiatives. So continually be looking for ways of doing that. The other recommendation would be to center your defenses around the idea of identity, because really user identity is the only constant that we have these days. Devices change, applications change, locations change, but a user's identity is one thing that follows them no matter what device they're using, what application they're using, and where they're working from. So look for ways of centering your defenses around identity, at least to the largest extent possible. Another best practice is to take steps to learn from the past. Now, I mentioned that a couple of those disruptors that I had mentioned on one of the earlier slides were things that I was going to come back to and talk about in a little bit more detail later on. And the ones that I want to talk about are Wi-Fi and bring your own device. Those might seem like some strange things to talk about with regard to remote work, but there were some lessons learned from both of those that I think are very applicable to today. So Wi-Fi and bring your own device were both big-time disruptors, and they had similarities to what we're going through. In both cases, shadow IT was a huge problem, and the solution ended up being to give the users what they wanted, but to do it in a very controlled way so that IT can maintain security. Now, shadow IT, for anybody who's not familiar with the term, is basically the idea of a user circumventing the IT department. Because if a user has a job to do and IT is putting all of these barriers in their place, making it harder for the user to do their job, then the user is just going to find another way to get it done. They're going to go around IT and use something unauthorized. So shadow IT is one of those things that we want to prevent if at all possible. And Wi-Fi and bring your own device were both major contributors to shadow IT back in the day. Wi-Fi, when it first came out, or maybe not when it first came out because it was really expensive and difficult to set up when it first came out, but once it went mainstream, I couldn't tell you how many stories I heard of organizations saying, no, we're not going to use Wi-Fi because it's not secure. and users would just go to the electronics store, spend however much, get an access point, and plug it into a network jack under their desk, and IT was none the wiser. So they had Wi-Fi. They just didn't know they had Wi-Fi. So that was an example of shadow IT. And the same thing largely happened with bring your own device. I heard stories back in the day of particularly executives buying a shiny new iPad and figuring out how to connect it to the network and accessing resources without IT even really knowing about it. So both of those trends presented major challenges, and they forced IT to stop and rethink how they did things. Now, in the case of Wi-Fi, the solution was to treat Wi-Fi networks as untrusted. Again, we're back to the whole zero trust thing. It was also an early indicator that the network perimeter was probably not going to be a fixture that was there to stay forever and ever. And this was really a radical transition in ways of thinking, because prior to the adoption of Wi-Fi, a lot of organizations would go to extreme lengths to ensure the security of their perimeter network. One of the organizations that I worked for example, actually would go around and any jacks for plugging a computer into the network that existed, if those jacks weren't actively being used, they would go in and cut the wires just so that somebody couldn't go out to some far off corner of the building, plug in, and access the network. So it was kind of an extreme thing to do for the sake of physical security, but this particular organization felt the need. And bring your own device was similarly disruptive. As I mentioned a moment ago, a lot of people would go out, buy their own devices, and then try to access business resources with them, even if they weren't necessarily allowed to do so. So organizations ended up getting around that particular problem by basically embracing bring your own device. And they essentially told users, okay, you can use whatever device you want, but there are going to be some rules around that device usage. We're going to limit the types of devices that you can use. Maybe we're going to place some limits on what types of resources you can access from those devices. So we're going to do it in a controlled way, but you can use that particular device. Now, supportability is also another big takeaway from that, because some organizations struggled early on with supporting all of these bring your own devices. You had help desk technicians who had only ever supported a Windows PC suddenly being asked to support iPads when maybe they had never touched an iPad in their life. So supportability was definitely one of those road bumps that came about along the way. So what are some examples of some of those bring your own device policy items? Well, one was that devices had to be enrolled, and that subjects them to configuration policies. Another was that maybe devices can't be jailbroken. A lot of organizations also put into place policies saying that lost or stolen devices have to be reported so that those devices can be remotely wiped. And then some organizations also put policies into place saying that any personal content stored on the device was subject to company policies. Now, that kind of falls into one of those gray areas. I don't want to get into that one too much, but it is just an example of a bring your own device policy item. And certainly these aren't the only ones. They're just a few examples of some of the more common ones. So how does any of that apply to what we're doing today? Well, even though we're not necessarily struggling with bring your own device and Wi-Fi, because those are things that we've all dealt with in the distant past, there are some lessons that were learned back then that can be applied today. Lesson number one is to look for ways to remove barriers that lead to shadow IT. Because remember, you don't want your users going around the IT department, especially if you're in a regulated organization that has to do things a certain way for the sake of compliance. So it's really important to look for things that maybe are stumbling blocks to users or that get in the user's way of being able to do their job in the way that they want to do it. And look for ways of removing those so that you minimize the chances of shadow IT taking place. Another lesson learned back then that can be applied today is to take steps to future-proof your remote work policy. Because one of the things that we've learned is that device types change over time. I mentioned the 286 that somebody bought at a yard sale. That's an example of a device type changing over time. Locations change. Users were previously working in the office. Now they're typically working from home. Applications change, so everything changes. So look for ways as you build out these policies to future-proof the policy so that you don't have to go back and revise them later. Since I've got a few minutes, I'll give you an example of a really insidious example of this. One of the, or I'll just go ahead and say, back when I was with the military, there were some, and I'm having to be careful here because a lot of what I did was classified, so I'm having to be intentionally vague. But when this particular unit in the military purchased computer hardware, there were a list of requirements that those pieces of hardware had to adhere to, a checklist, if you will. It has to have this processor, this much memory, and so on and so forth. Well, one of the items that was listed on that list of requirements was something that eventually went away. So the military ended up having to pay extra money to get PCs that were out of date simply because they wanted to be able to meet that requirement that was listed on a checklist somewhere. So that's an example of something that wasn't future-proof. So the lesson here is that as you design these policies, try to avoid doing anything like that would make them non-future-proof. Another recommendation that I would give you is to document your procedures for vetting applications. Because if applications change over time, then your users are inevitably going to want to use something different down the road. And you don't want to have to just deal with that on the fly as those challenges come. It's better to have a procedure already in place for vetting an application and deciding which applications make the cut versus which ones don't. Another best practice is to consider whether users should be allowed to grant data access permissions to applications. So a user gets an application, they install it themselves on their own personal device, and that application asks for permission to do various things, maybe to access the webcam, the microphone, and oh, by the way, it also wants to access your data. Well, you, as an IT person in whatever organization you work for, have an interest in ensuring the security of that data. So do you really want some random application that a user installs to be able to access your company data? Maybe there is a business use case for that, but maybe that's not something that you want to do. So that's one of those things that you should be looking at right now. And incidentally, there are controls that exist inside of Azure Active Directory that can be used to prevent user-installed applications from accessing that data. Another best practice is to use a unified tool for managing all of your endpoints, not a per-device type solution. Now, when I say a per-device type solution, I'm not talking about one of these where you have to have one tool for iPads, another for Android devices, another tool for Windows PCs. Certainly that's something you want to avoid, but I think as a whole, the world has moved past that quite some time ago. What I'm talking about is a management solution that has equal capabilities for each platform. Early on, when mobile devices in the corporate world first became really widespread, a lot of organizations tried to use active sync policies as a way of securing those devices. Now, if you're not familiar with active sync policies, they were something that came with Microsoft Exchange. And the idea was that a user could link a mobile device to their Exchange email box, and these active sync policies could be used to harden that device. They could do things like requiring the device to have a password. They could disable Bluetooth on the device or shut down the device camera. There were quite a few policies that you could pick and choose from so that you could configure the device in a way that made sense for your own organization's needs. So one of the interesting things about that, though, is that even though most of the devices that were in use at that point in time supported active sync, they all did so to varying degrees. And Microsoft actually had this great big long matrix on one of their web pages that listed operating system versus which active sync policies did and did not work on that particular device type. So all of this is to say that you want to avoid one of these solutions that offers better support for some platforms than others. Try to find a unified solution if you don't already have one that will allow you to manage all of these devices in an equal way. So another best practice is to look for ways to expedite the adoption of new governance and procedures that benefit the end users. Benefit the end users is key here, because one of the things that I've observed over the years is that a lot of organizations are really, really fast to put in super restrictive policies. But when things go the opposite direction and it's looking to give the users more freedom, those types of policies tend to take a lot longer to put into place. You typically have to convince a lot more people, and there's more hoops to jump through. But remember, if the goal is to discourage the use of shadow IT and to improve user satisfaction, then look for ways to make it easier to adopt those procedures that will allow users to change the way that they work or what they work from or how they work so that the users' lives will ultimately be improved through greater flexibility. Another best practice is that zero trust is becoming an absolute must. It's something that most organizations are probably already working on and have been for a while. But there isn't one single tool or technique or procedure that you can use to create zero trust. Zero trust has to come from a variety of different sources. But if you haven't really started on zero trust yet, then one of the best places that you should begin is by looking at conditional access policies. Conditional access policies are found in Azure AD, but you do need an Azure AD Premium subscription in order to be able to use them. And I don't want to go too deeply into a discussion of conditional access policies because it's a little beyond the scope of this presentation. But the basic idea is that in the past, access to resources was always based on user accounts and group memberships. A user logs on, they're authenticated, they try to access a resource, and the operating system says, okay, does this group that this user belongs to have access? Yes, okay, then we'll let the user access those resources. Well, conditional access policies allow you greater control with that process. So rather than just looking at group memberships, you can look at a number of different things. And in some cases, you can even look at behavior patterns. So maybe it's one thing if a user accesses the same application at 9 o'clock on Monday morning that they always access. Maybe it's a different situation where if the user attempts to access that same application at 3 o'clock in the morning from a rogue nation on the other side of the world, when they were just in the office a few hours ago. That's the sort of access that you would want to block. Well, those are the types of situations that conditional access can help you with. Think of conditional access as a series of if-then statements that look at more than just who's logged in and what groups they belong to. They can look at a number of other conditions. But the other best practice is don't depend solely on conditional access. Remember, zero trust is made up of a number of different procedures and products and everything kind of coming together to form a zero trust architecture. So never underestimate the importance of defense in depth. So let's talk for a second about compliance. 2020, when the pandemic first set in, was so disruptive that a lot of organizations just kind of looked the other way with regard to compliance. You know, all of a sudden everybody was working from home because they were forced to, and oh, hey, we've never had to deal with this sort of thing before. So there were some things we're just going to have to let slide. That was kind of the mindset for a lot of organizations at the time. Maybe not every organization, but those organizations were definitely out there. So the problem is that now the situation has become so normalized that compliance is back in effect, and organizations need to take a look at what they're doing that might violate their compliance initiatives. This is a really big deal for organizations that are in regulated industries. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that compliance audits often take a look at how well an organization is adhering to the policies that it has put into place within its compliance documentation. So if you've got a situation that doesn't really mesh well with what you've documented your procedures to be, the solution may be to update your documentation rather than try to shoehorn the procedures to fit what was already documented. But again, your options are going to vary widely depending on what compliance mandates you're subject to. Another important consideration is data backups. Let me grab a sip of water really quickly. So data backups. It's important to make sure that all of your organization's data is being backed up, obviously. But one of the problems from users working remotely is that you can never be 100% sure that users are storing data where it should be stored, either in your data center or up in the cloud somewhere, and not on the user's personal device. Unfortunately, that's just one of the realities of remote work. If you're going to let users use personal devices, there's always a chance that users are going to store sensitive data on those devices. So what do you do about it? Well, the most obvious thing is to discourage local device data storage. Explain to the users the importance of keeping personal data separate from corporate data, and explain where that corporate data should be stored so that way you can back it up. But under the assumption that users probably are going to end up storing at least some data, even if it's just temporarily on their personal device, maybe look at adopting enterprise file sync and share software. What the software does, if you're not familiar with it, is anytime the user is connected to the internet, it will copy the contents of certain folders up to a location of your choosing. So that way you've always got a copy of the data, and then once that data is centrally located, it can be backed up in the usual way. Also, it's really important to make sure that safeguards exist so that if a particular device is lost or stolen, then any data that the user has saved on the device can be wiped. So make sure that you have devices password protected and that you've got some kind of remote wipe solution in place. And then the last thing that I want to talk a little bit about, and I realize I'm kind of running low on time here, is work-life balance. Work-life balance is not exactly an IT subject, but it's one of those things that's impacted all of us since 2020. So I think it makes sense to spend a few minutes talking about it here at the end of the presentation. One of the big things that we've all learned is that technology has the potential to either enhance your life or control it. And the perception of technology can change over time. You know, I'll never forget when I was a little kid and the cell phones had just kind of started to become mainstream a little bit. Seeing a TV show, I don't even remember what show it was, but they were showing one person who was doing business on the golf course using his cell phone and couldn't be happier. And then they showed another guy who was letting his phone wreck his life. He was getting phone calls all night long about the stock market in Japan or something like that. And he seemed absolutely miserable because he couldn't get a good night's sleep because his phone was constantly ringing. So they were trying to show the good and the bad. But while both of those perceptions can be true, perceptions of technology can change over time. You know, I'll never forget quite a few years ago when devices like the one that you see on the screen had first started to become mainstream. I actually had this very device, and I was on vacation down in Key West, I think it was. Anyway, an editor called me and said, "Hey, I'm sorry to disturb you on vacation. I've got this project. I really need you to just take a look at what I've posted, make sure it's right, and then you can get back to your vacation." So because I had a device like this, I was actually able to open Microsoft Word, open the document, read it on the spot, and then email them back, and I was done in 10 minutes. And I was thinking, wow, this has got to be the greatest thing ever. So perceptions change, though, because at the time I'm thinking that's the greatest thing ever. Over time, though, we've become almost slaves to these devices. And so technology has kind of ruined our work-life balance. So it's important to regain a hold on that. So 2020 set a lot of unrealistic expectations, both for IT pros and for end users. For IT pros, 2020 set a lot of unrealistic expectations because we were all working insane hours trying to get remote work to actually function the way that it was supposed to. You know, it's one thing to work an insane number of hours during a crisis. It's another thing to be expected to work those insane hours indefinitely with no end in sight. So it's really important to try to reclaim some of that work-life balance. From an end-user perspective, there were similar problems because a lot of users were pressured into becoming workaholics. The mindset became, hey, you're at home, you're locked down, you're not going anywhere, you might as well be working. Oh, and make sure you're accessible 24/7. So that's why work-life balance has become such a problem. So what can you do about it? Well, unfortunately, there's not necessarily an easy solution to the problem, but there are things that you can do to help. Microsoft 365, for example, has an activity tracking feature that can help you to determine whether or not you have a healthy work-life balance. It takes a look at the types of work that you're doing and what hours of the day or night you're doing it in, and just whether or not you have enough personal time. And if you are getting those types of metrics, then that data can sometimes be useful for setting boundaries and reclaiming your personal life. You know, maybe you can show that data to your boss and say, hey, look, you know, I'm working 20 hours a day here. You know, what can we do about this? And I've provided a few links on the slide to some content that I've written on similar topics. So I want to wrap things up by talking about the top 5 tips that I've learned about work from home. As I mentioned, I've worked from home for 22 years now, so I kind of feel like I've got a handle on the thing. One of the big lessons that I learned right off the bat was to set expectations. In other words, if somebody wouldn't come to your job site when you're working in a corporate office and bother you there, they shouldn't bother you when you're working in your home office either. Also, maintain dedicated office space. Obviously, that's not practical for everybody because we all have different size homes and different needs. But if at all possible, try to set up a dedicated office space because that makes it a lot easier to walk away from your job at the end of the day and leave it behind so that you're not just constantly working. Another thing is that comfort matters a lot. If you're going to be spending a lot of time in your home office, look for things that you can do to make it more comfortable and more attuned to your own style and your own needs and wants. And then the second to the last one on the list is make sure that you get out once in a while. When I first started working from home, I realized that I was spending an insane amount of hours at home and that I was becoming a bit of a hermit. So I actually started making a conscious effort to get out at least once per day, just so that I could make sure that I wasn't just confining myself to my home and never leaving. And that actually did wonders for me. And then the last thing on the list, it's kind of obvious, but don't forget about me time. Make sure you're not spending all of your time working and do some things that you enjoy once in a while. So with that said, I know I've covered a tremendous amount of information in a short amount of time. Hopefully a lot of that made sense, and I think we've got some questions and answers to get to.
We definitely do. Thanks so much, Brian, for that presentation. Let's just jump right into the questions. Here's a good one. You mentioned conditional access policies. Is that something that is built into Windows?
No, it's not built into Windows. It's built into Azure Active Directory. But you will need an Azure Active Directory Premium subscription to be able to use that. I believe it's Premium P1.
Okay. This question comes from David. How can you draw the line between being the employee's personal IT provider versus support for business function?
Yeah, that goes back to those support policies that I was talking about earlier. That's a tough one that anybody who's ever worked help desk has had to deal with. We all know how it is to have somebody call the help desk and, oh, by the way, while you're at it, I'm having a problem with my system at home. My kid did such and such. And there's never an easy answer to that one other than just to be assertive, maybe a little bit more assertive than you would like to be, and set boundaries. Otherwise, you're going to be enslaved to people's home systems forever. One thing that I've sometimes used as an excuse is that once you touch somebody's system and do anything at all to it, most people are going to assume any future problems that they have are related to what it was that you did, even if it actually has no connection. So, play the responsibility card. Tell them that you don't want to be responsible for things that may happen in the future. Okay,
Lily wants to know, what's the name of that Office 365 activity tracking tool called that you talked about earlier?
Microsoft has changed the name of that tool several times. I believe the current name of it is Microsoft Viva.
Okay. This is more of a general question for you. Do you consider work from home and hybrid work to be a major disruptor, or is it really just an extension of trends from a few years before the pandemic?
I think that the case could be made for either, but I tend to lean toward thinking that it really is a disruptor because before the pandemic, remote work was becoming more common. But we've never, ever seen this situation before where all of a sudden, almost overnight, everybody was working remotely. So I would absolutely call that a disruptor.
Okay. You touched a little bit on the work-life balance at the end. In the grand scheme of things, how important would you consider work-life balance to be, especially for us all working from home these days?
I would consider it to be absolutely essential because if you don't have some sort of work-life balance, then the boundaries between work life and home life will be forever blurred, and you'll feel like you're constantly chained to your work. As somebody who has worked from home for over 2 decades, it's something I've absolutely dealt with. I've even gone through times in my life where I felt like, if I was out away running some errands, like, oh, I should really be checking emails right now, and I would catch myself constantly thinking about work. So you've got to find a way to separate the two.